The richest woman in Washington shoved a single father to the marble floor in front of 300 guests at the most exclusive charity gala of the year. She called him a filthy cockroach. She ordered him to kneel and wipe the spilled champagne with his bare hands, told him he had no right to breathe the same air as the people in that room. Not one guest spoke. Not one moved. Then the man on the floor lifted his hand and pointed at the enormous portrait hanging behind her, and she turned around. Elias Ward arrived at the Sterling Heritage Gala, the way he arrived everywhere without announcement. He came in a single black town car he had ordered, like any other passenger, stepped out alone onto the wet Washington pavement, and walked through the tall glass doors without a coat. He wore an old black suit, well-tailored once, but visibly aged at the cuffs, the kind of suit a man keeps because it still fits, and he sees no reason to replace it. He carried nothing. No assistant trailed behind him, no security swept the room ahead of him, and he gave the doorman a quiet nod that expected nothing and wanted nothing in return. The hall itself was built to make people feel small. The ceilings rose 4 stories into a dome of gold leaf, and chandeliers the size of small cars hung above tables dressed in white and silver. 300 guests moved beneath that light, the wealthiest and most powerful people in the capital, senators and developers, and the heirs of old money, all of them dressed in fabrics that cost more than most cars. Waiters carried trays of champagne through the crowd in slow, practiced circles. The air smelled of perfume and orchids and money, and the conversation never once dropped below a polite, expensive hum. Almost no one in that room knew exactly why they had been invited. The Sterling Heritage Foundation had announced weeks earlier that the evening would honor a single individual with its highest distinction, the man of the decade. The identity of that person had been kept deliberately secret, sealed by the organizers as a matter of theatrical pride. A great portrait of the honoree hung at the far end of the main atrium, but it remained hidden beneath a heavy velvet drape, waiting for the moment of unveiling near the end of the night. The guests had spent the cocktail hour guessing trading names of governors and billionaires, and not one of them had guessed the truth. Elias preferred it that way. For nearly 2 decades, he had built the Ward Horizon Foundation in near silence, channeling a private fortune into housing and education for families who had nothing, and in all that time, he had refused almost every photograph and every interview. The work mattered to him. His face did not. He believed with a stubbornness that frustrated his own board that the moment a man's face became the story, the people he was trying to help became scenery. So he had stayed invisible, a name on documents that tens of thousands of grateful families knew, and almost no one in this room would recognize. He took a single glass of champagne from a passing tray, held it without drinking, and stood near a marble column at the edge of the crowd. He watched the room the way a man watches weather, with patience and a faint private amusement. Loss had taught him stillness years ago, a quality the people around him lacked entirely. He did not need the room to look at him to feel that he existed. Celeste Harrington needed exactly the opposite. She entered the gala the way a storm enters a valley, and the crowd reorganized itself around her without being asked. She was the queen of New York real estate, the woman whose name rode the tops of glass towers from Manhattan to Miami, and she had built the Harrington Group into an empire by understanding one thing more clearly than her rivals ever had. She believed that a person's worth could be read off the surface of them, off the cut of their clothes and the weight of their watch and the deference in the eyes of the people who served them. She had never once been proven wrong because she had never once allowed herself to be in a room where she might be. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that had been flown in for the occasion, and diamonds at her throat that caught the chandelier light and threw it back, doubled. Men in tailored tuxedos turned toward her and lowered their voices. A senator's wife touched her arm and laughed too eagerly at something Celeste had not yet said. 2 younger developers hovered at the edge of her orbit, waiting for the chance to be acknowledged, and Celeste accepted all of it as her due. the way a person accepts the warmth of a fire she has paid to have lit. She moved through the crowd dispensing attention, like coins, a few words to a congressman, a cool half-smile, to a woman whose company she intended to acquire by spring. The people of Washington fascinated her in the way insects fascinate a child with a magnifying glass. She found them useful and slightly beneath her, and she had come tonight less to honor whoever the foundation intended to honor than to be seen honoring them, to let 300 influential people watch Celeste Harrington be gracious. Elias watched her cross the floor and felt nothing in particular. He had met 100 versions of her over the years, in boardrooms and at zoning hearings, and across the negotiating tables where his foundation fought developers for land that poor families needed more than the rich did. He recognized the type the way a doctor recognizes a symptom. He stepped back slightly to let her party pass, lifting his untouched glass out of the way. And that small courtesy was the thing that ruined the night. A waiter cut between them at the wrong moment. Celeste, turning to laugh at something behind her, did not see Elias at all. Her shoulder struck his arm hard, the glass tipped, and champagne spilled in a long pale streak down the emerald silk of her gown. The wine darkened the fabric instantly, and a few drops fell to the marble at her feet. For 1 second, the world held still. Then Celeste looked down at her ruined gown, and her face changed into something the diamonds could not soften. "You clumsy fool," she said loud enough that the conversations nearest them stopped. "Do you have any idea what this is?" Elias set his glass down on the column's ledge with a small, even motion. "I'm sorry," he said. "It was an accident. I'll cover the cleaning." The calm in his voice seemed to enrage her more than the stain. She looked at him fully for the first time, and what she saw confirmed everything she already believed. She saw the worn cuffs and the old suit, the absence of a watch, the man standing alone with no one behind him to defend him, and she made her decision about him in less than a breath. "Cover the cleaning," she repeated, and laughed, a hard, bright sound that pulled more eyes toward them. "This gown is worth $10,000. You couldn't cover the thread." She turned to the gathering crowd, performing now certain of her audience. "Look at him. Who let this and someone like you doesn't belong on this floor? Someone like you belongs out at the curb parking the cars." The hum of the gala had died completely. A wide circle had opened around the two of them, and 300 faces had turned to watch, lit gold from above, none of them moving to intervene. Elias did not look away from her. "You should stop now," he said quietly. There was no threat in it. It sounded almost like a kindness, like a man warning someone away from the edge of a cliff she could not see. But Celeste had never in her life been warned by a man in a worn suit, and the strangeness of it only sharpened her cruelty. She stepped closer to him, and her voice dropped into something colder and more deliberate, the voice she used to break tenants and underbid rivals. "You don't tell me what to do," she said. "Do you understand what you are? You're a cockroach. You're something that crawled in under the door and thinks the light is meant for it." She gestured at the marble floor between them at the few drops of champagne that had fallen there. "Get down. Get on your knees and clean that up. You've already cost me $10,000 tonight. The least you can do is wipe the floor like the help you are." A woman somewhere in the crowd drew in a sharp breath. A man in a gray tuxedo looked at his shoes. Not one person spoke. These were people whose fortunes touched the Harrington Group in a dozen quiet ways, through loans and partnerships and favors owed, and every one of them weighed the same swift calculation in that instant and arrived at silence. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to watch and say nothing and remember tomorrow that they had been on the right side of the most powerful woman in the room. Elias stood very still, and something passed behind his eyes that none of them could read. He had spent his life believing that a man's dignity was the one thing the world could not take from him unless he handed it over. And he understood, standing on that gleaming floor, under that gold ceiling, that he was being asked to hand it over in front of 300 witnesses. He thought of walking out. The doors were 40 feet behind him, and he could be through them in 20 seconds, into the cold and the rain, his dignity intact and the night forgotten. No one would blame him. No one would even remember his face. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, and when he spoke, his voice carried to the edges of the silent room. "I'm not going to kneel," he said. "And I think, Miss Harrington, that you've just made the single greatest mistake of your life." He used her name, and the use of it landed strangely in the room, because he had not been introduced to her, and she had not introduced herself. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, there and gone. Then her pride closed over it, like water over a dropped stone. And she chose in that moment the path she could never walk back from. My mistake. Her laugh this time was thinner. She turned and snapped her fingers toward the edge of the room, where 2 members of the building's security staff stood in dark suits near the wall. "You. Both of you. This man is not on the list. He has no business in this room. Remove him." The 2 security men exchanged a look. They had been hired by the Sterling Heritage Foundation, not by Celeste Harrington, and something in the situation made them slow. But she was Celeste Harrington, and the instinct to obey her was older and stronger than their contract, and so they began to move toward Elias through the parting crowd. Elias watched them come and did not retreat. He looked for a man about to be dragged from a gala remarkably unhurried. He had spent his life being underestimated, and he had learned long ago that there was a particular power in being the only calm person in a room full of people who had lost their heads. "Before they touch me," he said, raising his voice just enough to stop the 2 men in their tracks. "I think you should look at something." Celeste folded her arms across her ruined gown. "I'm not interested in anything you have to say." "I know," Elias said, "but you'll want to see this anyway." He lifted one hand slowly and pointed past her down the length of the great atrium to the far wall, to the enormous shape that hung there beneath its heavy velvet drape. It was the only thing in the room that had been hidden all night. Celeste did not turn at once. She held his gaze, certain this was some final desperate trick, and she let a smile of pure contempt settle on her mouth. "There's nothing back there for you," she said. "There's nothing back there, but the man this whole night was built to honor. A man worth more than you'll ever comprehend." She said it as a final blow, the cruelest comparison she could find, the great honored stranger set against the cockroach at her feet. "I know who that is," Elias said. Something in the way he said it flat and certain, and entirely without fear, finally reached past her pride. The crowd had gone so quiet that the only sound in the 4-story hall was the faint music, still playing somewhere far away. And 300 people were watching her now, instead of him waiting to see what she would do. Celeste Harrington turned around. At that exact moment, by an accident of timing, she would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. The organizers at the head of the room chose to begin the unveiling. The house lights dimmed. A single bright spotlight struck the far wall, and the velvet drape fell away from the portrait in one long, soft collapse of fabric, revealing the image beneath it to the entire silent room at once. The portrait was 20 feet tall. It showed a man in a plain, dark suit, standing without ornament, looking out at the viewer with quiet, steady eyes. Beneath the image, carved into a panel of pale stone, ran a single line of gold letters, large enough to read from anywhere in the hall. Elias Ward, Man of the Decade, for changing the lives of millions of American families. The face in the portrait was the face of the man Celeste Harrington had just ordered onto his knees. For a long moment she did not move at all. Her eyes went from the painted face to the gold letters and back, and the color drained out of her own face until the diamonds at her throat looked warmer than her skin. Behind her, the silence in the room began to change its texture. The held breath of 300 people slowly turning into a low-rising murmur as the same understanding moved through them all. The man she had called a cockroach, the man she had ordered to wipe the floor, the man she had told did not belong in the room was the only reason the room existed tonight. Celeste turned back to face him, and her mouth opened, but for the first time in her adult life, no useful words came out of it. Elias Ward picked his champagne glass back up from the ledge where he had set it. He had still not taken a single sip. He looked at her with no triumph at all, only a kind of distant, tired recognition, the look of a man watching something inevitable arrive exactly on schedule. "My name is Elias Ward," he said gently into the silence. "And you were right about one thing tonight, Miss Harrington. Someone in this room doesn't belong here." He let the sentence sit. Then he turned his head, taking in the 300 faces that had watched her humiliate him, and said nothing, and his voice when it came was quiet and even and final. But it was never going to be me. The power in the room, which had belonged so completely to Celeste Harrington 30 seconds before, was already gone. She could feel it leaving, draining out of her, and across the marble toward the man in the worn black suit, and there was nothing in all her fortune she could spend to call it back. The murmur that had risen in the great hall did not fade. It grew. 300 people who had stood silent while Celeste Harrington ordered a man onto his knees now found their voices all at once, and the sound of it filled the gold dome like water filling a basin. The thing that had given her power in that room, the certainty of everyone around her, had reversed itself completely. And now every whisper carried her name, attached to a word she had never expected to wear. Celeste understood with the swift instinct that had built her empire that she was standing at the center of a catastrophe. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She tried to take control of the room. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, turning from the portrait back to the crowd, lifting her voice into the bright, commanding register that had silenced 1,000 meetings. "Mr. Ward and I simply had an accident. A spilled drink. We were both upset. These things happen between people of standing." She produced a smile and aimed it at the nearest cluster of guests, the senators and developers, whose goodwill she had spent the night collecting. "I'm sure Mr. Ward understands." No one returned the smile. The senator's wife, who had laughed too eagerly an hour before, now looked at the floor. The 2 young developers who had hovered in her orbit had quietly stepped back into the crowd, putting bodies between themselves and the woman they had been so desperate to be seen with. The room had shifted, and they had felt it shift, and the safe side was no longer Celeste Harrington's side. Elias did not help her. He did not need to. He simply stood where he was, glass still untouched in his hand, and let her words die in the open air of the hall, and his silence was worse for her than any speech could have been. She had called him a cockroach in front of these people. There was no version of the next sentence that erased it. "Mr. Ward," she said, turning to him directly now, and the command had drained out of her voice and left something tighter underneath. "Elias, I didn't know. You have to understand the position I was in, the gown, the embarrassment. If you had simply told me who you were, none of this—" "You didn't ask who I was," Elias said. "You looked at my suit and you decided." He set the glass down on the column ledge for the last time. "That was the only information you wanted. What Celeste could not see, what no amount of her experience had prepared her to see, was that the room was no longer the danger. The danger was in the hands of nearly everyone in it, held at chest height, glowing. The phones had come out the moment her voice first rose, the way they always do now, drawn by the old human hunger to witness someone else's disaster. Dozens of guests had filmed the entire scene from a dozen angles. They had captured the spilled champagne, and the word cockroach, and the order to kneel, and the snap of her fingers toward security. They had captured the drape falling away, and the 20-foot portrait and the gold letters spelling out the name of the man she had tried to have thrown into the rain. They had captured Celeste Harrington turning around. By the time the valets brought the first cars to the curb, the footage was already leaving the building. Elias left quietly before the formal program could resume, slipping out a side door with the same lack of ceremony he had brought to his arrival. The foundation's organizers tried to stop him, mortified and apologetic, begging him to stay and accept the honor properly. But he only thanked them, said the night had not been about him, and walked out into the cold alone. He gave no statement. He spoke to no reporter. He went home and said nothing at all. And that silence would turn out to be the most powerful thing he did all night. Celeste did the opposite. She stayed and she worked the room, moving from group to group, with a brittle smile repeating her version of events. A misunderstanding, an accident, a man who should have identified himself. She believed even then that the situation could be managed, because everything in her life had always been manageable, with enough force and enough money applied at the right point. She had not yet understood that some things move faster than money. By the time she reached her hotel that night, the first clip had crossed 1 million views. By morning, it had crossed 40 million. The footage was on every screen in the country, cut and recut, slowed down at the cruelest moments. The audio of her own voice played back to a public that had never met her, and now knew exactly one thing about her. The words she had chosen had a clean, terrible clarity. There was no context that softened cockroach. There was no misunderstanding that explained, get on your knees and wipe the floor like the help you are. The internet did not need to be told what it had seen. The story had a villain, and it had a hero, and both roles had been cast by Celeste's own mouth. The press did what the press does when 40 million people are angry at a single name. It started to dig. Reporters who had spent years writing flattering profiles of the Harrington Group's glass towers now turned their attention to what lay beneath them, and the foundation of that empire examined closely. For the first time, proved to be far less solid than its reflection in the marble. A reporter named Marcus Bell at one of the major papers had been sitting on a thin file about Harrington Group labor practices for nearly a year, unable to get it past his editors, because Celeste was too important, too connected, too good for business to cross. The morning after the gala, his editors called him before he had finished his coffee. Suddenly there was appetite. Suddenly there was a green light. By the end of the week, his first report ran on the front page, and it described a company that treated the people who built and cleaned and serviced its towers as something close to disposable. The article was only the beginning. Once the first crack appeared, the rest came quickly because the cracks had been there all along, waiting for someone with the courage to point at them. Former tenants of Harrington Group buildings began to speak. They described low-income residents pressured out of their apartments through repairs that never came and rents that climbed past what anyone had been told to expect. Families pushed out of neighborhoods so the buildings could be emptied and resold at 4 times the price. One woman, a retired nurse named Eleanor Pratt, who had lost her apartment of 22 years to exactly that pressure, gave an interview that was watched almost as widely as the gala footage itself. She did not shout. She simply described what had happened to her plainly, and her plainness was devastating. Then the former employees came forward, and that was when the dam truly broke. A man named Daniel Reyes, who had worked as a building supervisor for the Harrington Group for 9 years before being let go, spoke first. He described a culture that ran straight down from the top, in which the people who did the physical work of the empire were spoken of and treated as lesser, in which Celeste herself had once, by his account, refused to ride an elevator with a maintenance crew and ordered them to use the service entrance in their own building. What had looked on video like a single cruel night was beginning to look like a pattern, a way of seeing the world that the gala had simply made visible. Others followed Daniel Reyes the way the first guests had drifted away from Celeste at the gala, each one made braver by the one before. a former executive assistant, a pair of contractors who had been stiffed on payment and threatened with lawsuits when they complained, a junior partner named Vivian Cole who had watched financial arrangements inside the company that she had been too frightened to question at the time and was no longer frightened to describe now. It was Vivian Cole's account that turned the scandal from a story about cruelty into a story about crime. She described carefully and with documents a pattern of financial manipulation inside the Harrington Group, the kind of layered self-dealing and inflated valuations that regulators are built to punish. Money moved between entities that existed only on paper. Properties were valued at whatever number served the loan that quarter. The empire that had looked so permanent from the outside turned out to be held together in places by accounting rather than by stone. Within 2 weeks of the gala, the questions had moved out of the newspapers and into offices with subpoena power. Through all of it, Elias Ward said nothing. The press camped outside the offices of the Ward Horizon Foundation, hungry for his reaction, certain that the wronged hero would want to twist the knife. He gave them nothing. His foundation released a single sentence, declining to comment on Ms. Harrington's situation and asking only that attention be directed toward the families its work served. And that restraint set against the daily spectacle of Celeste's collapse made the public love him more with every passing day. He had been called a cockroach and had answered by saying nothing and letting the truth do its own work, and the contrast was its own kind of verdict. Celeste, watching her own destruction from the windows of a hotel suite she was no longer sure she could afford to keep, finally understood that she was not dealing with a man who wanted revenge. She almost wished he did. A man who wanted revenge could be negotiated, with bought-off sued, exhausted. A man who simply stepped back and let her own words and her own history catch up to her, gave her nothing to push against. She had spent her life winning fights. Elias Ward had refused to give her one. The investors moved next, and investors do not have sentiment. The first to leave was a pension fund that managed the retirement savings of teachers, an institution that could not afford to be photographed in business, with a woman whose voice was on 40 million screens, calling a man a cockroach. Where one large investor goes, others follow, because no one wants to be the last one holding a position in a company that is becoming radioactive. Within days, the Harrington Group's financing partners were quietly distancing themselves, calling in what they could, declining to renew what they had. The empire had been built on the constant motion of money, on borrowing against tomorrow to build today. And the moment that motion stopped, the whole structure began to settle and crack under its own enormous weight. The board of the Harrington Group convened in an emergency session that Celeste was humiliatingly asked to attend rather than to lead. These were men and women she had appointed, people she had believed were loyal to her, and she walked into that meeting still expecting to direct it. She found instead a row of carefully neutral faces and a document already drafted. Marcus Bell's reporting had named several of them. The federal inquiry threatened all of them, and they made in that room the same cold calculation the gala crowd had made when she ordered Elias to his knees, except that this time the safe side was the one without Celeste Harrington on it. The chairman, a silver-haired man named Walter Voss, who had toasted Celeste at 3 of her birthdays, did the talking. He told her with the gentleness people reserve for things they have already decided, that the company could not survive with her name attached to it any longer. The investors were gone. The regulators were circling. The brand she had spent 30 years making synonymous with luxury was now synonymous with the worst night of her life. For the good of the company, for the good of the thousands of employees whose jobs depended on it, the board was asking for her resignation. "You're asking me to resign from the company I built," Celeste said. Her voice did not have its old force. It came out smaller than she intended, and hearing it small frightened her more than anything Walter Voss had said. "We're asking you to save it," Voss answered, "the only way it can still be saved." She looked around the table at the faces she had chosen and found nothing in any of them. There was no anger there, which she could have fought, and no cruelty, which she would have recognized. There was only the same quiet self-protection she had relied on her whole life, turned now against her like a blade she had forged with her own hands. Outside, the press was already reporting that her resignation was imminent before she had agreed to anything, because someone in the building had decided the leak served them better than loyalty did. Celeste Harrington had walked into the Sterling Heritage Gala a few weeks earlier as the queen of every room she entered, certain that the world could be read off the surface of a person, certain that a worn black suit told her everything she needed to know about the man wearing it. She had built her entire life on that certainty. And now, sitting at the foot of her own boardroom table, while men she had made decided her future, she felt the certainty crumble. And beneath it, she found a question she had never once allowed herself to ask. What if she had been wrong about more than one man and one suit? What if she had been wrong about how the whole thing worked? She had not lost only her reputation, which could perhaps in time be rebuilt. She had lost the empire itself, the power she had spent every waking hour of 3 decades constructing. And she had lost it, not to a rival who outbid her or a market that turned against her, but to 30 seconds of her own voice and a face she had refused to look at closely enough to recognize. The portrait still hung in the atrium of the Sterling Heritage Hall. The foundation had decided in light of everything to leave it exactly where it was. Elias Ward looked out from it, with the same quiet, steady eyes, over a floor where only weeks before the most powerful woman in Washington had ordered him to kneel. The federal inquiry that had been circling the Harrington Group landed in the weeks that followed, and it landed hard. What had begun as a labor story and become a financial story now became a legal one, with investigators pulling the company's records into rooms Celeste was not permitted to enter. The documents Vivian Cole had described turned out to be real, and there were more of them than even she had known. The empire was being taken apart from the inside one, filing at a time, and there was no longer any version of the future in which it survived in the shape Celeste had built. She resigned the way the board had asked her to in a statement written mostly by lawyers, and it changed nothing. Resignation had been meant to save the company by separating it from her name, but the name and the company had grown together for 30 years and could not be cleanly cut apart. The lawsuits came regardless. Former tenants, former employees, investors who claimed they had been misled about the valuations all of them filed, and Celeste found herself named personally in nearly every one. For the first time in her adult life, money could not solve the problem in front of her, because the problem was no longer about money. It was about the kind of person the entire country had decided she was, and there is no account large enough to buy that back. She moved out of the suite she could no longer justify, and into something smaller, and she discovered how quickly a life built on status empties out when the status is gone. The calls stopped. The invitations stopped. The people who had laughed at her jokes and sought her table did not return her messages, performing exactly the kind of cost-benefit she had taught them by example. She had measured every person she ever met by what they could do for her, and now that she could do nothing for anyone, she found that by her own standard, she had become worthless. It was in that emptiness, sitting alone in the dark, with the silence she had earned, that Celeste Harrington was forced at last to face the one thing her whole life had been arranged to avoid. The thought arrived without mercy, and without anyone there to soften it. Her fortune had bought her towers and gowns, and the deference of 300 people in a gold-domed room. It had never once bought her a single moment of something deeper, because she had never in her life offered anyone the only thing that earns it. Across the city, the man who had been called a cockroach faced a choice of his own. Elias Ward held in those weeks more power over Celeste Harrington than any court did. The public had handed it to him. 40 million people were waiting for him to speak, and he understood that a single interview, a single well-aimed sentence, would finish whatever the lawsuits had left standing. He could make certain she never recovered. He could turn the woman who had ordered him to his knees into a permanent national lesson, and the country would have cheered him for it. His advisors urged him toward exactly that. His board saw an opportunity, a chance to ride the wave of sympathy into a higher national profile, for the foundation to let the contrast between the cruel billionaire and the humble philanthropist work in their favor for years to come. They drafted statements for him. They lined up the interviews. All he had to do was say the word. He sat with it longer than they expected him to. The truth, which he admitted to no one, was that some part of him wanted to do it. He had stood on that marble floor and been told he was something that crawled in under a door, and he was a man, not a saint, and the desire to drive the point all the way home was real and human and difficult to set down. He had always believed that dignity could not be taken from a man unless he handed it over, and he found in those weeks that the harder lesson was not in keeping his own dignity, but in choosing not to strip someone else of theirs, even someone who had tried to strip his. In the end, he set it down. Not for Celeste's sake, but for his own, and for the meaning of the work he had spent 2 decades building. To grind her into the ground, using the same instinct she had used on him, the instinct to crush whoever stood beneath you, simply because you could, would have made him into a smaller version of the woman in the emerald gown. The win she had handed him was not the chance to destroy her. It was the chance to prove that there was another way to hold power, and that the other way was stronger. So Elias did not give the interview that would have ended her. He gave a different one instead. The Sterling Heritage Foundation, mortified by what its gala had become, offered to hold the honor ceremony again, properly this time, and Elias accepted on one condition. He would speak. Not about Celeste Harrington, and not about the night she had humiliated him, but about the thing underneath all of it, the belief that a person's worth could be read off the surface of them, the belief that had made that night possible, and that lived quietly in far more rooms than that one. He returned to the gold-domed hall on a clear evening some months after the first one. The portrait still hung at the far end of the atrium, beneath the gold letters, naming him Man of the Decade. The same kind of crowd filled the room, the powerful and the wealthy and the connected, though they regarded him very differently now. He wore the same old black suit with the worn cuffs. He had not bought a new one. The suit, he had decided, was part of the point. He walked to the front of the room without notes, and when he spoke, his voice carried to the edges of the hall the way it had on the night everyone now remembered. A few months ago in this room, he began. A woman looked at this suit and decided she knew everything about the man inside it. She wasn't entirely wrong to read the surface. We all read surfaces. It's how we get through a crowded room. The mistake wasn't that she looked at my clothes. The mistake was that she thought my clothes were the whole story, and that the whole story gave her the right to decide what I was worth. The room was silent, but it was a different silence than before, the silence of people listening rather than people hiding. I run a foundation, Elias went on, that has spent 20 years helping families who own one good suit, if they own one at all. I have sat across from thousands of them, and I can tell you that the woman who cleans this hall after we all go home tonight is worth exactly as much as everyone seated at these tables. Not as a kindness, not as a nice thing to say at a gala, as a fact. The dignity of a human being is not issued by their bank, and it cannot be revoked by anyone else's contempt. He spoke about the men and women who had come forward in the weeks after the gala, the supervisor, the nurse, the tenants, not by name and not as weapons, but as people who had been treated as less than human inside a system that had taught everyone to look away. He spoke about how easy it had been for 300 people to watch one man be humiliated and say nothing, and how that silence, more than any single act of cruelty, was the real disease. I'm not here to talk about one woman, he said near the end. What happened to her, she set in motion herself, and I take no pleasure in it. I'm here to talk about all of us, and the quiet little ways we decide every day that some people matter more than others. That's the thing worth fighting, not her. That. He announced that night that the Ward Horizon Foundation would launch a national campaign on human dignity aimed squarely at the way working people were treated inside American companies, funded at a scale that made the room go quiet for an entirely new reason. He turned the worst night of his life into the seed of the largest effort of his career, and he did it without once raising his voice against the person who had given him the wound. The speech was recorded the way everything is recorded now. By the next morning, it had reached as far as the footage of his humiliation had reached months before, except that this time, the country was not watching a woman fall. It was watching a man refuse to push her. The contrast did more for the cause than any attack could have. A man who had every reason to take revenge and chose instead to build something turned out to be far more persuasive than a man simply seeking justice. Celeste Harrington watched the speech alone in the small apartment that was all her life had narrowed down to. She had braced herself. When she heard he was finally going to speak for the blow, she knew she deserved the public, naming the final humiliation that would close the circle. It never came. He had held the knife and set it down, and somehow that was harder to receive than the cut would have been, because the cut she could have resented, and his mercy left her with nothing to resent but herself. She did not become a different person overnight. The story tells no such fairy tale. The lawsuits ground on, and she lost most of what she had, and the social world that had once revolved around her never fully opened to her again. But something in her had cracked on the night the drape fell away, and in the long quiet that followed, something different began slowly to grow in the gap. She had learned far too late, and at the cost of everything, that the deference she had spent her life collecting had never once been the same as the thing Elias had walked out of that room still holding. The Sterling Heritage Gala that had begun, it all became, in the telling, the largest public collapse Washington society had seen in a generation the night the queen of every room learned she was not the most important person in the building. People would describe it for years: the spilled champagne, the order to kneel, the velvet drape falling away to reveal the face of the man on the floor. It became a kind of modern parable retold until the details smoothed into legend. But the core of it stayed true to what had actually happened, because what had actually happened needed no improvement. Some months after the speech, the Sterling Heritage Foundation made one final decision regarding the hall. They renamed the Great Atrium, the space that had hosted a century of galas, where senators and developers and the heirs of old fortunes had gathered beneath the gold-leaf dome, was given a new name, carved into the same pale stone that held the portrait. From that point forward, it was called the Ward Atrium. The 20-foot portrait of Elias remained where it had hung on the night everyone remembered the man in the plain, dark suit, looking out with quiet, steady eyes. The gold letters naming him Man of the Decade stayed beneath it. But the foundation added one more line carved fresh into the stone below the first, and it was this second line that the visitors who came through the hall in the years afterward tended to stand in front of the longest. Do not measure the worth of a person by the clothes they wear. The words sat there in the marble for anyone to read, beneath the face of a man who had been called a cockroach in that very room, and had answered not with cruelty, but with a campaign to lift the people the world preferred not to see. Elias Ward went back to his quiet life when it was done. He gave no more interviews than the cause required. He did not buy a new suit. He returned to the work he had always done, the work that had never been about his face or his name, the work of helping families who owned one good suit or none at all, and he let the noise of the whole affair fade behind him, the way he had let the noise of the gala fade on the night he walked out alone into the rain. He had not set out to ruin anyone. He had set out on an ordinary evening in a borrowed black suit, only to receive an honor he had never wanted in public. What he had been given instead was the chance to show an entire country the difference between the two kinds of power, the kind that crushes whatever stands beneath it, and the kind that lifts, and to demonstrate in front of 40 million people which of the two actually lasts. The lesson the whole story left behind was the one carved into the stone beneath his portrait, and it was older than any of the people in that gold-domed room, older than the Harrington Group and the Ward Horizon Foundation and the gala itself. Pride blinds people to the true worth of those around them. A fortune can fill a room with people who bow, but it cannot purchase character, and it cannot purchase kindness, and it can never, under any circumstances, purchase the respect that one human being freely chooses to give another. Celeste Harrington had owned almost everything a person could own, and had learned that none of it was the thing that mattered. Elias Ward had owned almost nothing that the room could see, and had walked out of it, carrying the only thing that did.